with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Okay, everybody, welcome to the Phronesis podcast. Thank you so much for checking in wherever you are in the world. Today, I have Professor Laura Empson. And she is an academic, a speaker, an advisor. She has dedicated 30 years to researching professionals and the professions. Funded through a series of prestigious government awards, her research encompasses themes as diverse as leadership and governance, organizational culture and identity change, mergers and acquisitions, professional careers and diversity, partner evaluation and reward systems, and the future of professional work. Now, she has been conducting academic research into professional organizations for her entire career. She is the professor in the management of professional service firms at Bayes Business School, University of London, and holds research fellowships at Harvard Law School and Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. Alongside her academic work, she serves, as I said, as an advisor to many of the world's leading professional organizations. She is also a fellow podcaster, so she has a warm place in my heart. And her podcast, and all of this will be in the show notes for everyone, Leading Professional People. Now, Laura, something that is so interesting about you, and I'm going to let you speak in a moment here, but you, in a very, very beautiful way, kind of straddle these two worlds. You started your career in business, and then you went and got a Ph.D. And so you bring this really beautiful perspective of kind of existing in both worlds. You are an academic, but you also are a business person and work with and speak with and really, really work alongside professionals. So before we jump into that conversation, maybe share with listeners a little bit more about you. What's something else that we should know about you before we jump into the dialogue?
Scott, it's great to see you again. And thank you for inviting me to be on the podcast. Well, I started my PhD when I was 30 at London Business School. So I had 10 years before that working in investment banking and strategy consulting. So my identity, and I'm really interested in identity formation, was really shaped by my experiences of working in the City of London and working for a global strategy consulting firm. I never really wanted to be an academic. And indeed, when someone told me that they were thinking of doing a PhD, I really laid into them and told them they were ridiculous. And then about a year later, I found myself applying for a PhD at London Business School. And what prompted me to do that was that I was in the middle of experiencing the third extremely painful merger of my career. And I was seeing the leaders of these firms making the same mistakes over and over again. And to some extent, investment bankers, when they mess up with management, you can cut them a bit of slack. But when strategy consultants are making the same kind of stupid mistakes, I thought there was something important I wanted to understand. And to try and make sense of my own pain and the pain of my colleagues, I asked the librarian in our consulting firm to do a literature review, a search for me on the topic of research into mergers between professional service firms. And he came back the next day and said, there isn't any. And it was literally one of those light bulb moments. I remember sitting at my desk and it just went ping.
Wow.
I thought, I have to do this. And as much as anything, it was because I had to get out of my work situation. I was desperately miserable and very angry. And I had thought about giving it all up and sitting on a beach in Bali for 6 months. But instead, I went and did a Ph.D. at London Business School for 5 years.
Bali or a Ph.D.? I don't know.
Well, I would not have been happy in Bali. I know myself well enough to know that. And I had been very happy doing my master's degree at London Business School. And I went back to LBS to think about it. And I walked into their library and I smelt books and I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. And I realized that I was drawn to scholarship, and I always have been. But still at that stage, I wasn't intending to become an academic, but things just developed and I ended up taking a position at Oxford at Saïd Business School. And the rest is, I wouldn't say the rest is history. That sounds really pretentious, but the rest is my history, at least.
I love that phrasing. The rest is my history. Well, I'm so excited. You just mentioned Oxford. We have a trip this summer. So our goal was to get our kids to all 50 states. And then we accomplished that, here in the United States. And then my daughter came down one day and said, "So what's our next goal?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Well, what about every continent?" And so we kind of got really kind of excited about this notion. So last summer we were in Greece, but this summer, the trip, we have some friends outside of London. And so we're going to be in England for 10 days. And so we actually have a couple nights in Oxford booked. And of course, some time in London. And so I'm just so excited to get to your quote unquote neck of the woods.
Well, literally, and I do live surrounded by forest, so in Oxfordshire, actually. So yes, it's some wonderful woods.
We'll have coffee this summer.
That would be good.
Well, okay. So, I mean, obviously you've published in some of the world's greatest journals, Harvard Business Review. Again, you are interacting with these individuals leading global organizations, talking with these individuals on the podcast. What are some observations that you've had in recent times? You're kind of steeped in the literature. What kind of keeps coming up for you that you're seeing that's intriguing you right now?
Well, I think one interesting question is why continue to study professionals for 30 years? And the answer is that they continue to intrigue me and fascinate me. The phenomenon they're dealing with, they encompass all of the most complex management and leadership problems you will find in any organization. They're a microcosm of all of those issues because they are the ultimate people businesses. So from the perspective of a scholar of organizational behavior, if you want to study people in organizations, professional service firms have got a lot of them. And there are some very, very, very powerful and very, very successful organizations that are not necessarily run at all the way that our textbooks would suggest they should be run. And that always also intrigues me. And I think one of the reasons is because of the peculiar nature of their power dynamics. The people who often own these organizations, they're sometimes owned by hundreds of people who work internally within the firm, see each other very much as peers. And these are relatively unhierarchical organizations. Once you make it sort of around about the age of 35, once you make it into this inner cohort of people who have a stake in the organization. And that means that leaders can't rely upon the conventional levers of power. Hierarchy is extremely contested and very ambiguous. At the same time, the professionals are highly autonomous. So they have their own book of business. They often have their own team. They have their own profit centers, and they have their own very strong opinions. And they don't submit very well to being told what to do. So a simple way of thinking about it is imagine an academic department or imagine a group of faculty. Why should the professors agree to do what the head of department or the dean says they should do? The answer is most of the time they actually really don't. Some of them are polite about it and others are rude about it. But that conventional idea that you want to rise to the top, that you want to become head of department, you want to become dean, doesn't really apply in academia. And it doesn't apply in professional organizations because what they really get a kick out of, like what you and I get a kick out is our research. What they get a kick out of is working with their clients. And all the leadership stuff, the management stuff, that feels to them like bureaucracy and administration. And someone else can do that as long as they're doing the right things, but they reserve the right to criticize, to complain, or ignore. and ultimately to depose, because a lot of the leaders in these firms are elected, certainly at the most senior level. And often, it's surprisingly often, they are brought down or they are not re-elected for a second term. So all of that creates these weird power dynamics, which I find endlessly fascinating.
Well, you're in the realm, whether it's the dean or the lead partner in the law firm, or, you're in the realm of influence. And how educated are they on, even simple topics like influence tactics? Like, how are we going to influence others and build a coalition? And because you're right, you're in that realm of that space versus using power or authority to get work done.
One of the odd things, and this is, I guess, where I've been able to carve out a contribution and a space for me in terms of my engagement with practitioners, is they're not very educated on this at all. Mm-hmm. So they might have done some kind of courses. The consultants will often have done MBAs, but the rest of them won't have. And what they know is what they're hearing in the classroom isn't relevant to them. So when they pick up a management book in the airport, it doesn't resonate with them because it just doesn't fit. They're not trying to lead, Walmart or a big commercial bank or something. They're trying to lead these very awkward, spiky individuals.
Maybe we'll call the episode that, Awkward, Spiky Individual.
Well, so then the challenge is, well, what do they read? And I'm pleased to say quite a lot of them read my books or my HBR articles, or increasingly, they're more likely to be listening to the podcast. And as you know, there are thousands of podcasts out there with the word leadership in it. But what they consistently say is that there is something very special about the particular dynamics of leading accountants, of leading consultants, of leading bankers, investment bankers, of leading lawyers, any kind of professional. And we can broaden that. We can look at people like academics, for example. I've also heard this, apparently my research, or the podcast in particular, is big with oncologists in the US. They love it.
Yeah, healthcare is a very similar dynamic. Depending on the organization, but yes, you have a lot of that work is influencing these highly specialized individuals who may even have their own business. Places like the Cleveland Clinic or the Mayo Clinic, they're employees. But yes, that's another definite context.
And my favorite context is apparently the bishops of the Anglican Church also see very significant relevance to my work. And the most recent episode of the podcast I did was with the general counsel, the chief lawyer of MI5 and MI6. And there are really clear parallels there. So on the one hand, what you'll find is particularly lawyers think they're unique. And, unless you're very specifically talking about lawyers to lawyers, they're not really that interested in hearing you. So they don't think they have much to learn from other sectors. So on the one hand, there's this really, really narrow focus. But on the other hand, these groups that I never intended to speak to are finding the podcast, finding my books, finding my articles and saying, that's us. She gets us. So that's this weird combination of generalizability and specificity. You asked me sort of what really intrigues me. It's the weird complexity of trying to bring together a group of individualistic, opinionated individuals into some kind of collective whole to work towards some kind of common endeavor. And that is at the heart of it. That is the essence of the fundamental organizational challenge, that all organizational behavior goes back to that root. But you see it in its purest sense in professionals.
Well, okay. So what's interesting is for the individuals you've come across who do that work well, what are some of the themes that stand out for you? I have to imagine, and maybe I'm stealing your thunder here, but something like someone who's adept at building relationships and truly spends some time building relationships with those people that they're going to need to influence would be high on my priority list, at least.
That's important. It starts, first of all, with being outstandingly successful as a professional.
Okay, so you have that street cred, so to speak, of I've built the book of business. I model that. You're in the door.
That is essential. So you have to role model the thing that they most aspire to being, which is a phenomenally successful client relationship manager and high quality technician in terms of the work that you do. You've got to be an outstanding professional. And then that's the kind of qualifier. Then you need the other stuff. So relationship skills, absolutely important. Political skills, really important. The ability to network internally as well as externally. So to understand just how much time it takes to get anything done, to spend as much time on developing your relationships with your peers as you would in your previous work of developing with your clients. Apparent sincerity is also pretty important as well. If we go back to some of sort of the core political skills, and people always laugh when I talk about apparent sincerity as an important leadership quality in these organizations. And the point is, it doesn't actually matter whether you're being sincere, truly. I don't know what's going on in the heart of the people that I'm studying or interviewing, but that you can convey that image to the people you're dealing with so that they feel you, they feel that you're hearing, they feel that you respect them, they feel that you care about them. And if you've got these underpinnings of having also done their job astonishingly well, first of all, they will cut you some slack. You will be able to influence them more effectively.
Okay, so there's a couple things in there that I really find fascinating. I mean, yes, you're totally right. Like, we don't know what is in the person's heart. I imagine if it's truly there, that's going to be helpful. That's more sustainable because we're going to find out if it's not at some point. But totally understand the spirit of what you're saying there. And then, we on this podcast, at least, have not spent really any time talking about kind of that political skill. What are a couple things that you think about? Because I think you're exactly right. And I think at times the political skill, it can feel like the word power, for some people, that it's kind of a bad thing or that influence is a bad thing. Well, it just is. I think humans make it so, whether it's good or bad or used for good or ill. But when you think about political skill, could you unpack that a little bit? Because I think that's a really interesting, what are some of the real dynamics and the real skills they have to have in this space to be successful?
Well, the most important one is that other people don't think that you're politically skilled.
Interesting.
If people are going around saying, oh, he's really politically skilled, they don't necessarily mean that in a good way.
Okay.
So if we go back a bit, when I talk to professionals, they are often quite uncomfortable with this idea of discussing politics because they'll confuse that with Machiavellianism or they'll confuse that with national politics and see that as dirty and self-seeking and inappropriate. But the reality is, for them to be effective with their clients, they likely will have quite sophisticated political skills because they do need to manage, to charm, to effectively manipulate the client over a sustained basis. What I think distinguishes the really effective leaders from the less effective ones is they don't realize that they also need to be doing that when they get home, or rather when they get back to the office. And I see two different kinds of ways of being political in these firms amongst the leaders of these firms. I mean, two good ways, I should say. There are a whole bunch of bad ways, and that's one of the things I am going to be writing about and publishing about next. The two good ways are quite different, and they tend to be performed by different kinds of people. So one is always thinking several steps ahead.
Okay.
Having a long-term plan for the organization, maybe 5 years out, and thinking not just strategically, but who do I need to get to do what by when in order for this to work? So one leader of a global accounting firm I spoke to said they see themselves as playing chess. And they always need to think several moves ahead. And when they say something in a board meeting in March to some particular person, that's because they're already planning at the April board meeting to ask them something else. And they know that by having interacted appropriately with them in March, by having, raised them up, lifted them up amongst their peers, that when the big ask comes in April, they'll have a natural ally, for example. So it's putting there as much effort into developing the internal relationships as you would if you were trying to win a multi-million-pound piece of work. That's one version. Another kind of political skill, which I think is just as important, is and this is going to run really contrary to current rhetoric around authenticity, is the ability to be the person you need to be in that moment in order to achieve the outcome you want with that particular person. So I find it intriguing with senior leaders I know really well is how they are with me. And then I watch them go into a situation with clients or with junior staff or with their peers, and they shift. They're like shapeshifters. They become the person that they need to be in that moment to achieve the outcome they need to achieve. And it doesn't mean that there isn't a sort of hard core of authenticity that runs through them, but they've got the social skills in order to read the room, to read the situation, and continuously adapt. So the person who's very good at the latter may not necessarily have the same that's a much more kind of intuitive, instinctive response. The first person plans it like a military campaign. The best outcome is when you have dual leaders, and a lot of these firms have leadership dyads at the top, where people bring together both sets of qualities. So there'll be the chess person and the shapeshifter person. And together, they keep each other honest and can say, you know what, this is not the right time for you. I need to handle that situation. Or, you know what, you completely messed up on that. I'm going to go back and talk to this person again and try and calm them down about the proposal that you made.
Well, it's so interesting because I think, again, at times we might label the shapeshifter as, to your previous point, inauthentic or, manipulative, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what's interesting about this conversation and what's fun about this conversation is that I think for each one of us, we are shape-shifting. I mean, how I'm speaking with you right now is not how I spoke with my son this morning or my wife on our walk at 5:30 a.m. that I was texting you about. And, I also am a little bit of a different version when I'm in front of 100 people who are executives in an organization. And there's a core of who I am, but for the different contexts, I'm probably going to have to show up in a little bit of a different way and employ what's appropriate for that situation, right?
And the better you are at that is going to be bound up with how secure you are in yourself.
Yes.
And people who want these roles and put themselves up for election in order to satisfy some kind of insecure ego need, who crave power and control to help them deal with some, deep-rooted fear, and who want to be the big I am in order to make themselves feel special, often don't get elected because their peers can see through that. And some of them have worked together for, 20 years or so, and they'll think, the guy was a pain his first year out of graduate school, 20 years on, he's still a pain. I am not going to let him run my firm.
Yes. So that's interesting. So we have the individual who is the shapeshifter, the individual who can show up in these different contexts and have that social and emotional intelligence to adjust depending on the situation, while still, because I imagine, again, to your point of there's people who do this badly, I imagine that person who isn't anchored, there isn't a center of gravity in who they are, what they stand for, that self-awareness, that integrity. Again, it can happen, and it does happen, but it's probably not sustainable internally and externally if, to your point, they're just meeting some deep-rooted need to have power. Well.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the two elements to that, well, one is, like I said, they often get deposed. So they may step forward in a time of crisis and say, yes, our profits are tanking because the previous leader was a complete idiot, but trust me, pin all your hopes on me. And they can give a good speech on the hustings. I mean, and this is where it does get a lot like, national politics. You do get populist leaders coming forward in times of crisis, and they sometimes do get elected, but they don't necessarily last that long.
Wow. That is such an interesting connection, that kind of the populist playbook working internally in some of these firms. I've always associated with, government or politics externally to countries. But that's so interesting.
There was one firm I studied where they often talk about becoming corporate, and what they mean is the professional organization as a whole. We used to be good, but now we've become corporate. And by that, they mean we've become bureaucratic, we're losing our autonomy. And the chief executive he stopped calling himself the managing partner. He's now called the chief executive. and he's got a chauffeur and there's the C-suite. And we don't do that here because we're all peers. So one of the firms I studied, the existing leadership had gone too far down that route.
Okay.
And they had anointed their successors for the next election. And the partnership would absolutely not going to do it. They would not elect the anointed successor of these people. Instead, they elected someone who's on his platform statement, his big tagline was, not make America great again or whatever, or take back control. It was give the partnership back to the partners.
Wow.
And all the partners, not surprisingly, said, yay! And they all elected this guy. And then they said, so what are you going to do? Because there were some performance problems. But unfortunately, this particular person didn't have a plan,
a slogan,
or any particular aptitude for turning around a difficult situation. He was just saying, well, I've given it back to you. You fix it. I said, well, we're too busy. We're too busy trying to make money. Your job is to get us to work together effectively. So that's an example. And this is a bit of a clunky transition, Scott, but we haven't actually talked about collective leadership. We haven't used that phrase yet. And I realized, of course, most of what I'm talking about has collective leadership behind it. So maybe we should spend a couple of minutes.
Let's
that
real quick. Yeah, please.
Okay. So when I started thinking about leadership, it was over the course of probably the first 10 years of my research, looking at organizational change, looking at organizational governance, a whole bunch of things like that. I kept seeing weird leadership things happening, and people kept telling me, stay away from leadership. You're not a micro person. You're not a psych person. You're not a positivist. You're not a quantitative person. Leadership belongs to those people.
Which you probably saw a gap at that point.
Well, no, I was just scared because I'm quite confident. I'm sort of averse to jumping in the deep end like that. But in the end, I just thought, look, this is here. Leadership is everywhere, and it's weird in these organizations. And I don't understand it. And I can't find anything in the books which help me understand it. But I'd come across a few articles, including a very influential one by Anne Langley on collective leadership in medical organizations. And just gradually, more and more scholars started using the word collective leadership. It was still a small group, but there were also concepts like Mary Albean's work on relational leadership, distributed leadership, which was relevant as well. Although distributed leadership is a bit different because it implies there is someone with power to distribute. The collective leadership was much more amorphous and peer-based. So I started my research. At that stage, I'm not even sure I wasn't using the word collective leadership. I was just talking about leadership dynamics. And over the course of my research study, more stuff was being published on collective leadership and more literature reviews were coming out, and it started to become a thing. So now everything I've been talking about so far, I would bring together under the category of collective leadership. So how is it that you work together with colleagues in very ambiguous peer-based environments to influence and bring about some kind of outcome which is broadly fits within the collective understanding of what needs to be done? But within that, there are continuous sort of micro negotiations amongst these peers in order to make anything happen.
Yes. And in a context where, again, to your point, these contexts are pretty fascinating with highly individualistic individuals who are experts in their craft with strong opinions about that expertise. The population you're trying to influence is an interesting set of characters as well.
Yeah. And I often ask, why? Because when I see people stepping up for these roles, they're giving up so much. They're giving up the thing that's kept them motivated, to work for normally long hours, maybe for 15, 20 years, which is their client work. And there are lots of different reasons why they do it. Sometimes it's they're bored. They're really intellectually curious people. They're already the leading person in a particular field, and they're very driven. So they need to find another mountain to climb. That's one reason. Sometimes they are incredibly ambitious for the organization. I often speak to leaders who have a sense that maybe that their firm is languishing at about, fourth in the global rankings or something. I know collectively we can do so much more. And if only, we could make it happen. And then some of them, it's just because they're angry. And I always remember the guy who I asked, why did you put yourself forward to run this firm? And he said, because I realized I was fed up with lying awake at night feeling angry
Wow.
with our leader. And I just thought, to hell with it. I've just got to get rid of him. And there's no one else stepping forward, so it's going to have to be me. They get pressurized to take on the role from their peers. So people say, please put your name forward.
You'd be awesome. You're reminding me of the motivation to lead scale. I don't know if you've explored that literature, but yeah, that whole kind of why do people step up? And of course, to go back to maybe some of the negative reasons, I think there are a faction of people who it's meeting some deep inner need, some insecurity, something that they haven't worked out, and it's going to give them the power and authority to wield. And you see that at times in law enforcement, or you see that at times in go back to the clergy. It's at times people move into these roles because it's going to meet some need for them, not necessarily more of an altruistic reason. And so fascinating. Well, as we begin to wind down our time, let's talk a little bit about the podcast, because I want listeners to understand, to know of your work. And are there a couple conversations you've had maybe recently that have caught your attention and might be of interest? I can put these in the show notes so that people can access that work. I mean, as you know, this is so much fun. It's such an interesting kind of existence to get into these conversations and kind of look under the hood a little bit at some of these folks' lives. I mean, I've had a blast. I have just absolutely really, really enjoyed this process. And so how about for you? What are a couple of conversations that stand out and that have excited you?
Well, I was very careful about this because I'm conscious I need to maintain relationships with all the people that I've done podcasts with. And each one of them in their own way is precious and special and fascinating, yes, highly respected by me. Of course, that goes without saying. So
look at those political skills right there, Laura. That was so awesome.
Well, look, everyone gives up their time to do this. And these are sometimes, people leading global firms. Why the hell should they speak to me?
Exactly. No, I get it.
I have to make it a positive experience for them. I think there are two that really, there are three actually that really stick in my mind in the most recent series.
Okay.
First one I want to mention is my interview with the ex-global senior partner of one of the world's leading law firms called Slaughter and May. And the theme of that was subtle power.
Wow.
And what was fascinating was, listening back to our interview on multiple levels, really deconstructing the language that he'd used the whole way through. And I didn't say to him, I'm going to interview you about subtle power. The word subtle got added on afterwards as a title. Even in simple ways, the self-deprecating way, the way he implied that he wasn't really a leader. And it was almost the way he negated himself constantly and modestly, whilst at the same time, if you know the guy and you know the reality of the situation, you realize that he was immensely effective at playing us as interviewees.
Wow.
So he was exercising his political skills over us as we interviewed him about his political skills. And that was amazing.
That's meta. That's three-dimensional chess.
And then I sent him an email afterwards where I reflected this back to him, and I hesitated because I thought I don't want to insult him, and he just sort of very sweetly sort of just replied and said, "Absolutely, Laura." Something, and he had no problem with that at all. But it was an act of seduction. He was seducing us as we interviewed him, myself and my co-host Tony Hall. The second one that had a really powerful impact was the interview we did with Professor Giampiero Petriglieri at INSEAD, where we talked about the whole emotional dimensions of leadership and the psychodynamics of leadership. And we went pretty deep for an interview about emotional issues. And that was, for me and to my co-host, and Giampiero is a psychoanalyst by training. And I think we all three of us went to places we hadn't set out to go at the start. But I think the interview was really, really powerful for that reason. The third one that really sticks in my mind is my interview with this MI6 guy, which I have to say I was probably more scared about than any other interview that I've done on the podcast. And he was great, but I was just so conscious that he'd been sent away. These guys are trained to know how to resist torture, even the lawyers, right? So there was nothing very much that I was going to do, which would cause him to say anything off the cuff or spontaneous or even slightly controversial. So again, this process of how did I get him to talk? And one of the things I remember was I was interviewing him from his home. And it happens to be, I didn't realize he's right by the helicopter port for central London. So every 5 minutes or so, a helicopter would go overhead and we'd have to stop. And I became convinced I was waiting for special air service people to come through the skylight and drop down from the helicopter. And I was expecting to see these little feet dangling just in the background with the podcast, because every time I felt he might be about to say something controversial or particularly off the cuff, I was just waiting to see these little dangling feet as the special forces took control of the interview. So in different ways, those were all really fun.
Oh, that's great. And what have you liked about the process? I mean, we talked a little bit about this in Copenhagen last fall, December, but, I think it's such an interesting, not necessarily valued by our institutions from an academic standpoint, but just this really fun and just exploratory project that you never know what you're going to uncover. I didn't know that this conversation was going to go the way it has, and I've been fascinated by it. But what have you found in that realm?
Well, Scott, my approach is very different from yours. So I am very directive in how I do it and how tightly I edit it. So I don't have these same kind of opportunities for surprise that you do.
You are a little more locked down and straight and narrow, right? On the pathway. Yes.
And in a sense, I think it needs to be for the audience that I've got. I mean, they won't listen for more than 30 minutes. Apparently, these stats are not very reliable, but we have an exceptionally high listen through rate, which means that almost everyone who starts listening gets to the end, keeps listening. And I think that one of the reasons is because it's boom, 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 delivering material the whole way through. But that's just what my audience needs. What have I got out of it? Well, we started this in lockdown. I was lonely and I was depressed. It was a great excuse just to have really interesting conversations with really interesting people.
We are together on that one. Yes.
So it started that way. I've really, really loved learning a new skill. And I suppose a bit like those, successful professionals who then put themselves up to become CEO, it's great sometimes to go right back to the beginning and think about, how do you put these things together? I've also had in my most recent series the great opportunity of working with Tony Hall, who was head of the BBC and was previously head of news at the BBC. So working with, someone with that kind of journalistic training and just hearing how we'd get to the end of an interview and he just said, Laura, where's the story? There's no story. And I'd have to sit down and think, okay, we've got to construct a story. So learning to be that sort of focus driven to get the content out in the first 3 minutes has been a real learning for me. I think the final thing the biggest kick I've got out of it, and the biggest surprise is nowadays, whenever a professional reaches out to me, it's because they know me via the podcast. So I'll get these messages from people saying, we love your work. And I'll say, oh, what have you been reading? Which of my books, which of the HBR articles? And it's like, what? Oh, but we love that episode where you interviewed the science guy. And I realized that increasingly professionals have not got time to read. But, they work out in the gym, they walk their dog, they travel to work. They just stick the podcast in and listen to that. It's about 30 minutes. It's about the length of a dog walk or, it's a session on a treadmill. That's how they're getting their content. And I think that quite a lot of them do listen to it when they're on holiday, because I've got listeners in 130 countries, which is weird. But if you actually look at the countries with the smallest number of listeners, they tend to be places like the Seychelles or Barbados. They tend to be really high-end holiday destinations. So I think quite a few of them listen while they're on the beach as well. So I think for me, it's been the biggest surprise has been the reach, the impact, and the fact that I've kind of stumbled upon a gap in the market.
Yes.
Which needed to be filled, which was great. But it was just started because I was lonely and depressed, and I reached out to a friend of mine and he said, I was thinking of doing a podcast. I said, can I do it with you?
Well, I started a editor's introduction of a special issue for a journal that I'm working on. And I kind of went on a little bit of a rant, so to speak, and it's been taken out since. But, what's so interesting about your space and the work that you're doing is that I think in a lot of ways, push back if you disagree with me, but I think a lot of ways academia has been disrupted, and it's been disrupted and decentered by a number of these firms. Business leaders are not going to academics. They're going to McKinsey, they're going to Bain, they're going to Deloitte, they're going to PwC for some of this thought leadership now, and overlooking the local university as the center of gravity for knowledge. I think we've been disrupted in some ways. I think we used to be that center of gravity of knowledge and expertise, but I don't know that we are any longer. And what I love about your space is that you're looking at this through both of those lenses and creating this really, really nice spot for a rigorous intellectual conversation. Because as you know, some of the limitation of some of those organizations' research is that it can be fairly simplistic, and it can be something that is just a tagline to get people's, it's clickbait as well at times. But you're bringing a more nuanced and important conversation to the table with that breadth of knowledge and the language and the world that they're living in. So your comment about the podcast, I think it's brilliant. I mean, every university should have a podcast and be talking with alumni and talking with people out in industry, because I think it's a beautiful combination. All of our work, it's behind a paywall. It's behind a paywall and it's lost. And all of this work is maybe behind a paywall eventually, but it's more of a lost leader for them than it is, the bread and butter, so to speak. So I just very much respect your space, because I think it's doing a great service to the industry and those professionals, because it's complex, it's difficult, and we have to look a little bit deeper than maybe some of what we're being clickbaited into, but we can't be so deep then it's not translatable, which some of our colleagues can get into that space.
I'm absolutely with you, Scott. And I use the phrase intellectual junk food. And I think that a lot of leaders are raised on a diet of intellectual junk food because that is what's saleable. And it might be through the books that they read, or, the more, shall we say, practitioner-oriented management journals, or even a lot of what's happening on LinkedIn. So every time someone says to me, Laura, what do you think of the 5 key messages for senior leaders in this kind of situation or something? And I think, oh no, they can literally only think in bullet points.
Yeah.
And so to talk to them about how those 5 bullet points might be densely interconnected by how pressing too hard on one of these bullet points might have unintended consequences for another of these bullet points. How, in fact, there's a whole extra page on the PowerPoint slide with 10 more bullet points that they really do need to bear in mind. These are complex and subtle and uncomfortable realities. And there is this, we've talked about the leadership industry in Copenhagen and previously, there is this massive sort of industrial complex of the leadership industry trying to simplify and package and monetize really trivializing recommendations. And my concern is that if that's the only diet you've been raised on throughout your professional career, you lack the ability to see behind that, and you're uncomfortable with anything that is more ambiguous and more subtle. By contrast, some of our academic world is so mired in ambiguity and subtlety that it never even gets itself published. We all know scholars whose thinking is so densely intertwined and subtle that they can't actually put it down on a page and get anyone to read it. Yep. So we need the balance. But I like always to question, to challenge, and to gently probe. I try to do that in a way so that at the end of the call, that's the end of my interview, people really enjoyed it and want to talk to me again. But I also want to leave them slightly discomforted and thinking perhaps a little more critically about some of the sound bites that they've been trained by their PR people to regurgitate.
Yeah, the intellectual junk food. I really like that phrasing. And we'll wind down here, but the populist playbook is to say, I have a slogan. I'm going to take all this complexity and make it super simple for you. I alone can fix this. And
give the partnership back to the partners.
Yes, exactly. And, no, that's probably that's not probably going to get us where we want to be. So, well, I really, really appreciate your time today. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for your good work out there in the world. And for listeners, there's going to be a whole bunch of links in the show notes so that you can access Laura's work. And you know what? We'll do it again. We'll do it again. I very, very much appreciate your time.
Looking forward to seeing you again, Scott.
Okay, be well. Okay, the practical wisdom for me in that conversation. Well, first, listen to the Leading Professional People podcast. Another really interesting approach and perspective on this topic of leadership, an important perspective. And Laura is interviewing just some incredible people. And you got a little bit of a taste of some recent conversations that have caught her attention. And I hope you have an opportunity to check into those. Are you a lifelong learner? If you are, you're exploring, you're listening to podcasts, you're reading, you're taking in new information from new sources and constantly trying to become a better version of your current self. As Carol Dweck says, becoming is better than being. For me, that's the practical wisdom. Laura models that, and for that, I'm very, very thankful. November 7 through 10, International Leadership Association. Hope to see you there. And as always, can't thank you enough for checking in and listening. If you like what's happening here, share it with others. Please, please, please. As always, take care. Be well. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.